What happened when the US cracked the code and doomed Hitler? The secret code that could have changed the course of the war. How the breaking of Enigma led to the fall of the Third Reich. We'll take a detailed look at what happened, who's to blame, and the consequences. Support the channel by subscribing, commenting, and sharing this video. This topic is too serious to ignore. They thought victory belonged to those with more guns, heavier tanks, and louder marches. In Berlin, they believed that war was about metal, numbers, and fear. But across the ocean, they were thinking differently. There, in the quiet of laboratories and university basements, the Americans were building their weapon. Not out of steel, but out of ideas. They weren't shouting slogans or waving maps, they were simply thinking on another level. Germany was betting on engineers, on geniuses creating monstrous machines, rockets, tanks, and codes. The United States was betting on a system where even the most complex idea could become a tool. Where the Germans relied on individual brilliance, the Americans built a collective mind of engineers, programmers, radio operators, logicians, mathematicians, women with typewriters, and men behind relays and bulbs. They thought as a single machine. The Reich's pride and joy was its encryption machine. They called it a wonder. It was shown to officers as a symbol of superior German science, the Enigma. The electromechanical heart of the war, rotating through endless combinations. Every day, a new order, a new key, a new world. They were confident that no one could peer inside this code. In Berlin, they laughed. Let the Yankees try if they have the brains for it. But across the ocean, they weren't just trying, they were cracking it. The Americans weren't trying to solve the puzzle by hand. They set out to build machines that could think for them. It was a shift the German school couldn't comprehend. Where the German mind trusted instinct, the American mind trusted systems. And the system worked. At first, Berlin didn't realize that the secret of Enigma was already cracking. The Reich's radio operators sent transmissions with a sense of absolute security. They knew every letter passed through rotors, that every message became an indecipherable murmur. But that murmur was already being heard. The Americans weren't competing with the Germans in complexity. They were competing in efficiency. They knew a person makes mistakes, a machine repeats them. And if you make a machine repeat quickly, your enemy's mistakes become the key. This is how the first true electronic revolution of the war was born. Instead of dusty abacuses and endless tables, there were metal boxes with flashing lights, buzzing relays, spinning drums. These machines didn't feel, but they could calculate. And in a world where every day was decided by a radio transmission, calculation became stronger than heroism. They took it step by step. First, the British felt their way. Then the Americans perfected it. Where the British solved by hand, the Americans built machines. Where the Germans took pride in their machines' elegance, the Americans built a conveyor belt that could tear elegance apart serially. And then one night, on an American base, radio operators heard the familiar rhythm of a German transmission. The machines worked without rest, the laboratory smelled of ozone, the lamps buzzed, the relays clicked, and suddenly, a flash. One of the machines produced a match. The key of the day was found. Enigma opened. At that moment, when a German officer sent a message about the new position of his submarines, those coordinates were already known to the American command. He thought he wielded invisibility, but in truth he was under a spotlight. From that day on, war stopped being a fair fight. It became a chess match, where one player saw the whole board and the other played in the dark. Germany kept believing in its machines. They made codes harder, added new rotors, strengthened communication discipline. But it didn't help. The Americans didn't just decode Enigma. They decoded the logic of German thinking. They understood how the radio operator thought, how the officer wrote, how the commander shortened words, how the engineer loved order. And that became their greatest weapon. This wasn't a clash of technologies, it was a clash of mindsets. The Germans believed that the one who created the most complexity would win. The Americans proved that the one who thought more broadly would win. While Germany invented another Wunderwaffe, the United States turned science into industry. They didn't have a cult of genius. They believed in the process. Every engineer could contribute an idea. Every worker could improve a mechanism. And when that chain was set into motion, the Reich was left in the past. They didn't just deceive German radio operators, they made them work against themselves. Every transmission, every signal became a hook. The German wrote with confidence, the American read with interest. And the more confident the Germans became, the deeper they sank in their own arrogance. There's a moment, rarely spoken of. The Americans didn't use all the decoded data immediately. They waited, they hid, they were patient, so the enemy wouldn't realize they were being read. It took calmness and discipline. Victory wasn't a flash of brilliance, it was the cold breath of strategy. When the German admiral reported coordinates for the convoys, he didn't know that those numbers were already sitting on the American table. When the general ordered the movement of a division, he didn't know the Americans had already planned their bombing run over that very spot. Each transmission became a mirror. Germany looked into it and saw its reflection, too sure of itself, too smug. At some point, even the German officers started to notice something strange. The Allies always seemed to hit the targets they shouldn't have, too accurately, too timely. But the explanation was always the same: coincidence, intelligence, luck. They couldn't believe that their weapon of wonder had become their weakness. The Americans never called it a wonder. To them, it was just work. They didn't worship the machine. They used it as a tool subordinate to human logic. Where the Germans trusted iron, the Americans trusted reason. And that reason acted not out of pride, but out of practicality. That's why America was able to fight a war on 2 continents at once. That's why their fleet sailed across the Atlantic and Pacific, knowing the enemy was blind. Because war is won not when the shots are fired, but when the moves are known. The one who knows has already won half the battle. That's the real secret. The United States didn't just outplay German engineers. They outplayed the very concept of war that existed before them. Where Europe lived in the rhythm of trenches and tactics, America created a new science, the science of information management. And that's where the difference in generations lay. Germany created weapons for war. The United States created systems for the future. Even when German submarines were still sinking ships, even when Berlin was still hoping for a miracle, underground laboratories across the ocean were already working on the first machines capable of thinking faster than humans. And those machines would later become the foundation for computational systems that would change the entire 20th century. It turns out that the Americans didn't win just the war. They changed the very nature of victory. They won because they bet not on heroes, but on intellect. Not on genius, but on collective effort. Not on strength, but on structure. And that's what allowed them to deceive and outmaneuver the Reich. When Germany built its iron fortress, America quietly crafted the key. When Berlin declared its codes unbreakable, Washington was already reading them in real time. When the German general raised a toast to the victory of technology, American engineers celebrated the victory of thought. And while posters showed pilots and tankers, the real battle wasn't fought in the air or on the ground. It was fought in the mind. And they won it not with the flash of light, but with the depth of thought. Today, decades later, we can say with certainty the victory wasn't brought by wonder, but by logic. Not by power, but by method. Not by weapons, but by the ability to understand that the enemy can be defeated not by bombs, but by ideas. Write what you think. Do you agree that the real war is won not with cannons, but with minds? Could the Reich have been saved if it learned to think like its opponent? Or does arrogance always fly higher than reason and fall first? And so ends the story of how the Americans won without a shot fired. They simply started thinking on a different level, and the entire world understood that it is this that makes a nation great.